He was the boy from New Zealand who turned pain into poetry and struggle into song. Keith Urban didn't just dream of country music, he reinvented it. From small-town stages to global arenas, his voice carried the sound of heartbreak, hope, and redemption. But behind the fame, the awards, and the flashing lights, Keith's journey wasn't always easy. Every note he played came from a place of deep scars and second chances. What really drove him to keep fighting when the world said he wouldn't make it? Stay tuned, because the story of how Keith Urban rose from broken beginnings to reshape country music forever will move you to your core. Every lyric he wrote carried the echo of survival, each note a testament to pain turned into poetry. From Grammy wins to platinum albums and sold-out arenas, Keith Urban became more than a musician. He became living proof that brokenness can still sing. And then came Nicole Kidman, born under the vast Pacific skies, shaped by the fierce resolve of Australia. She was meant to blend in with the crowd. She was meant to redefine the very language of cinema. From shy girl silenced by a stutter to a woman who disappeared so completely into her characters that audiences forgot where fiction ended and truth began, Nicole didn't just perform, she transformed. Every role was a wound reopened, every silence a prayer. When their paths finally crossed, it wasn't just love, it was art meeting art, pain meeting purpose. Together, they became an empire of emotion. Music and film intertwined, two souls who had both bled their way to brilliance. To the world, they looked unbreakable. But away from the spotlight, the applause faded and shadows began to rise. Relapses, distance, quiet heartbreaks began to rise. Relapses, distance, quiet heartbreaks hidden from the cameras. What seemed like a fairy tale became a test of endurance between two people who once vowed forever. And now, at 57, Keith Urban has broken his silence. After nearly 19 years of marriage, he has revealed the truth, not a story of betrayal or scandal, but one of grace, quiet pain, and the courage to let go. Their ending isn't filled with noise, it's written in silence, the kind that follows when love has given everything it possibly can. Before we begin, if their journey ever touched your heart, take a moment to like this video, as a tribute to two souls who turned their struggles into art and showed the world that even love, when it ends, can still be beautiful. Before the spotlight, before the Grammys, before the world called his name, there was only a barefoot boy standing in the ruins of his own innocence. Keith Lionel Urban's story didn't begin with fame, it began with fire. Born on October 26, 1967, in Whangarei, New Zealand, his early life was anything but calm. When he was just 2 years old, his family moved to Caboolture, Queensland, in search of hope. But instead of finding peace, they found struggle. At the age of 9, Keith watched as everything he knew turned to smoke. His home, the walls that held his childhood, was consumed by flames that roared through the night. The smell of burning wood filled the air. Toys turned to ash, and memories vanished into the sky. Standing there, trembling and lost, he learned his first lesson about life, that everything you love can disappear in an instant. In that moment of despair, it was strangers who stepped in, offering secondhand clothes, gentle words, and kindness that Keith would never forget. Years later, he would recall, "We had nothing left except each other and the people who cared enough to help." But the fire outside was only a reflection of what burned inside his home. His father, Robert Bob Urban, a man who loved country music as fiercely as he battled his own demons, struggled with alcohol. His temper was unpredictable, his silence just as heavy. Behind closed doors, the young Keith faced a different kind of storm, one that no one could see, and no child should ever have to weather. What rose from those ashes, though, wasn't just a musician, it was a survivor, and that fire, both real and emotional, would shape the sound, the soul, and the story of Keith Urban forever. Keith's heart was filled with fear by the same individual who initially put a guitar in his hands. "I don't remember him ever saying he loved me," Keith admitted years later. Tenderness was a stranger, affection was lacking, and the words that every child longs to hear never materialized. Like a confession of an unhealed wound, every phrase trembles. That absence was not sadness, it was destruction. At home, the nights were oppressive, with the bang of a door cracking like thunder and stillness weighing more than fists. Nevertheless, a delicate gesture flared in the ruins of that turmoil. When Keith was 4 years old, he began strumming a ukulele. Bob taped a handmade sign that read, "Guitar teacher wanted for my son." That sign became his salvation, guiding little Keith to Sue McCarthy, the teacher who became his first safe harbor and the first person to believe in him. The guitar was never just an instrument. In a volatile household, it was a shield, a voice, a lifeline clutched by a boy desperate to survive. Keith bled into strings and chords with a desperation the world mistook for discipline. At 6, he held a guitar, not like a toy but like armor strapped to a frail body. Nights stretched in smoky pubs, his parents finging him from gig to gig, and he played on stages, too big for a heart still so broken. He collected accolades like the Golden Guitar at Tamworth festivals, standing next to Jenny Wilson, and dazzling audiences who saw only brilliance and never the fracture beneath. Later, in a voice full of thanks and sorrow, Keith admitted, "Music saved me." The cheers boomed like waves, but they never filled the chasm inside. When home didn't seem like home, it provided a place for me to go. Those were not performance words, they were an epiphany chiseled from suffering. His early years weren't just difficult, it was heartbreaking, isolating, and unfair. Despite the fire and fists, the forgotten embraces, and the unseen bruises, Keith Urban remained unbroken. He had been forged. He transformed agony into poetry, quiet into melody, and wounds into rhythm. And this is the real beginning of his story, not in a Hollywood star's embrace or the glitz of red carpets, but amid the ashes of a boyhood that was cut short. A boy who grew up to be a man, who made the world listen, but who never heard the words he yearned for. The echo of that barefoot boy gazing into the flames, realizing that music might be reborn as salvation even from devastation, was carried by every song, stage, and love he would one day cling to, including the woman who appeared sent to heal him. Nicole's childhood started in silence, but Keith's was shaped by fear and fire, the kind of quiet that makes a child feel like she doesn't belong and may never do. Her mother, Janelle Glennie, belonged and may never do. Her mother, Janelle Glennie, quietly pursued nursing while her father, Anthony Kidman, pursued a doctorate in psychology. She was born on June 20, 1967, in the humid city of Honolulu, Hawaii. Despite being born in America, her heartbeat would develop in Australia, where two cultures intertwined within her, frequently leaving her feeling both awestruck and alienated. When Nicole was just 3 years old, the Kidman family moved back to Sydney, where she and her younger sister Antonia grew up in a house that appeared to be a haven of wisdom and kindness. Conversations about psychology, philosophy, wisdom and kindness. Conversations about psychology, philosophy, and caring were all over the dinner table. Her mother was an educator and editor, and her father was soon a well-known scholar. Nicole, however, carried a storm in this caring world that had no name, just stillness. Her speech was stifled by a stutter that prevented her words from escaping, and she was excruciatingly timid. Years later, recalling the void of loneliness of those years, she would say, "I remember being afraid to speak up as if my voice didn't belong to me, a youngster encircled by genius yet imprisoned in an unseen cage where no one could hear her screams." Nevertheless, a gateway opened even amid that quiet. Nicole discovered ballet when she was 3 years old. Her tiny body was filled with movement and music, which seemed to be a coded language of liberation. She had transformed from a shaky youngster with sad eyes to an unbound energy on stage. Finally, she was heard without sound and seen without words in that hallowed place. However, the world outside the stage was ruthless. She stood out like a flame in a dark room with her porcelain skin, lanky body, and fiery locks. Others laughed cruelly. Lanky body and fiery locks. Others laughed cruelly, trying to extinguish the light. The feeling of being the other turned into her shadow as whispers followed her through the school hallways, their derisive looks more piercing than a knife. Nicole, however, resisted giving in to it. She turned her estrangement into power. From loneliness, empathy grew. Resilience hardened in the face of ridicule. Her parents led her into the Australian Youth Theatre because they were aware of both her intelligence and her frailty. Her life would be changed by the crucible. She met Naomi Watts under harsh stage lights and dusty scripts, one that would endure forever. More significantly, though, Nicole discovered her first real echo of her own voice. She recounted, "It was the first time I felt I belonged somewhere," her voice quivering with remembrance and relief, as though a door that had been sealed throughout her life had been opened. She then took risks that most teenagers would never think to take. She made her Bush Christmas 1983 debut at the age of 14. Her on-screen persona is already radiant. Her power now came from her stillness. She bravely decided to forgo the security of traditional schooling and fully dedicate herself to acting when she was 16 years old. For Nicole, the leap meant survival, even though it could have scared others. Her parents provided unflinching support after noticing the delicate flame burning within of her. Her light had always been visible to them before the rest of the world did. However, those formative years weren't ideal. They were years of not being seen. She spent years hiding behind stolen personas because she still felt insecure in her own skin. Nicole later said, "I felt invisible a lot. The ability to feel without armor, to bleed emotion without filters, to carry empathy like a second skin, what outsiders dismissed as fragility, her quietness and her hesitancy was actually her most profound gift. Every trembling glance and every whisper of pain she would one day bring to the screen was born from these hidden years, from silence, from ridicule, and from the agonizing art of survival." And this is where the extraordinary truth takes root. Nicole Kidman's story is evidence that sometimes the quietest kids become the loudest truths. Her alienated and silent upbringing did not break her. Rather, it honed her empathy skills and taught her that the stage can become a place where the invisible are finally acknowledged, that silence can become power, and that wounds can become a voice. It was from this tender, unsteady strength that she entered her next chapter, not just to be seen but to be heard. What followed was not fate, not chance, but fire. From that trembling child came a woman who turned ridicule into resilience, who turned being different into being unforgettable. Nicole Kidman is proof that even in the deepest silence, destiny is already writing its loudest song. Her journey from a child silenced by a stutter to an icon whose voice would one day shake the world is a blazing ascent of fearless roles and uncompromising choices, of characters so raw that they blurred the line between acting and truth, awakening in every audience member the unspoken ache they carry in silence. A boy from Caboolture condemned to prove that his guitar was more than an escape from pain, but a voice strong enough to be heard. And Keith carried wounds that burned like fire, scars of fists, flames, and forgotten love that nearly consumed him whole, while Nicole carried a silence that once convinced her she did not belong. At the age of 8, when most kids were still holding on to toys, Keith Urban stood under dim lights on rickety stages in smoke-filled pubs and dusty fairgrounds. His journey from child prodigy to international country icon was never quick or easy. Rather, it was a cruel one marked by rejection, tenacity, and a faith so rash it verged on desperation. This was no stage of dreams, it was survival ground zero, with a guitar almost as big as his body strapped against him like armor, the stench of still beer hanging in the air, the sting of cigarette smoke burning his lungs, and others shouting over his music as if daring him to continue playing. Keith would later think, all we had left was music, and some nights even that felt like it could vanish. His parents, still bearing the ashes of the fire that had once consumed their home, became reluctant tour managers, taking him from back row gig to back row gig in a car that rattled like their hopes. By the age of 15, his talent was undeniable. His fingers danced with the dexterity of a virtuoso, but his eyes bore the weariness of a soul already beaten by too much pain. He dazzled audiences on New Faces in 1983 and in duets with Jenny Wilson, and his golden guitar at Tamworth was evidence that he was born with brilliance. For him, every chord was not performance, but prayer. Not applause, but oxygen. But despite the glittering trophies, his world remained small, his stages too narrow, and his towns too blind to contain the fire inside him. Inspired by Knopfler's accuracy and Buckingham's grace, Keith created a blend of electric fire and country twang that was too rock for country and too country for rock. Labels rejected him, but Keith used rejection as fuel. For most, it would have been enough a profession, praise, and safety, but Keith Urban was not most people. I just wanted to play, he later said. I needed music more than I needed air. His 1990 debut under EMI was an album that hardly made it beyond of local circles. His choice to leave his hometown, family, and every semblance of security for Nashville in 1992 was less motivated by ambition than rebellion, and he waged a silent struggle against all the voices that had told him he was insufficient. I knew no one, he said. Nashville was cruel, and he admitted, I had no plan B, recalling evenings spent in rented rooms where loneliness was like a second skin. He played background guitar, sold songs to others, and lived with the hollow sting of never-ringing phones. His band, The Ranch, briefly seemed to be his salvation, but even that promise vanished, leaving him once more with nothing but the ghosts of fire and fists whispering failure in his ear. Doors didn't close politely, they slammed. He later acknowledged, maybe I'm not meant to do this, recalling depressing nights when silence was louder than applause. Despite this, he continued because, at that point, music was not a dream but oxygen, and every empty bar, every song given to a different voice, and every humiliation hardened and reshaped him into steel. His self-titled American debut, which came out in 1999 like a spark in the dark, was proof that scars could be turned into symphonies and that a boy, forged in silence, fire, and fists, could rise to the top of the charts. It took 7 years for the storm to finally break. Fame did not come to Keith Urban quietly. Rather, it came like a long overdue storm, a promise he had bled for and finally demanding to be kept. After years of anonymity and heartbreak in Nashville, 1999 became the reckoning. He did not achieve fame by chance or luck, but rather by surviving every storm that had once attempted to silence him. He didn't just show up on the charts with his self-titled American debut and the hauntingly honest, but by God's grace, he claimed them with shaking hands and a fiery voice. Its ascent to the top was not a stroke of luck, but confirmation that scars could indeed become songs, and he didn't just get up from there. The world had finally caught up to the sound Keith had been carrying alone for years, music born of pain, rejection, and a stubborn will to survive. But success did not heal the wounds, rather, it magnified under harsher lights. He exploded in 2002 with Somebody Like You, which broke records and was later named the biggest country hit of the decade by Billboard. Even though Keith was loved by millions, he frequently admitted that he felt more alone than ever, as if clamor of 20,000 voices couldn't overpower the whisper of childhood ghosts telling him he wasn't good enough. Even nights at opulent hotel rooms felt more empty than the smoke-filled pubs in Queensland, where he used to perform for drinks. Even as Grammys gleamed on shelves, he battled imposter syndrome in silence. With Be Here 2004, he delivered hits like Days Go By and Making Memories of Us, solidifying not only his place in country music, but also reshaping its very DNA by combining pop, rock, and twang. Very DNA by combining pop, rock, and twang into something unadulterated and uncontrollable. Albums went triple platinum. But behind the trophies, Keith would occasionally look into the mirror after a show, wondering if the man staring back was truly worthy or just surviving on borrowed time. Years later, he admitted, "There were nights when I felt like the applause belonged to someone else." Arenas roared with sold-out crowds, and awards rained down: 4 Grammys, 15 ACMs, and 13 CAS. They never saw the shadows at the periphery of the spotlight, the old habits that lurked, constant temptation to outrun his own past. The world only saw the grandeur of Keith, the chart-topping artist and American Idol judge whose wit and sensitivity won hearts between 2012 and 2016. By the mid-2000s, his success was astounding. Millions of albums sold worldwide, tours that brought in tens of millions of dollars, endorsement deals, and a signature guitar line that sold out in months, pushing his fortune towards $75 million. However, he admitted that at times, he felt like that kid from Cobular again, lost in the noise, still trying to prove I belonged. Keith Urban's rise was never a smooth crescendo. Rather, it was a series of jagged peaks torn from valleys of rejection and doubt. His story was never about basking at the top. None of it erased the fire that forged him. Every chord he struck still echoed with the weight of fists and flames from his youth, and every lyric still carried the ache of survival. As Keith carved out his place with songs forged from fire and survival, Nicole was about to face Hollywood's most fundamental reality. That brilliance, no matter how undeniable, can still be caged by the stories others choose to tell. It was about singing louder every time he refused to break and surviving every storm that tried to bury him. Nicole was already burning on screen long before the world hailed her as an icon, not with speckle but with a quiet intensity that unnerved everyone who watched. In Dead Calm, she was a storm concealed in still waters, and in BMX Bandits, she was the wild spark of youth. Nicole never begged to be seen. Instead, she demanded it, making every look a wound and every pause a blade. The world ate up their romance, but Nicole muttered to herself, "I will not live in anyone's shadow." She proved it when she dominated the screen. As Suzanne Stone in To Die For 1995, her ambition so chilling that it left critics speechless. Her first real collision occurred with Tom Cruise in Days of Thunder 1990. By 2001, Nicole didn't need to prove herself, she commanded it. In the others, she haunted every frame with fragile ferocity. The Golden Globe she won wasn't acclaim, but a declaration of war. She was here to rule on her own terms. Next came Eyes Wide Shut, 1999, Kubrick's Labyrinth, where fiction and reality entwined until it almost destroyed her marriage. "That role tore something open in me," she admitted years later, and the Oscar nomination that followed was not recognition. She also bled on stage as Satine in Moulin Rouge, singing through cries and coughing blood between takes. Although there was evidence that she had donated parts of herself, her legacy was elevated by the hours of 2002. The silence in the theater was hallowed the night Nicole received the Academy Award, and audiences knew they had not watched acting but a woman unraveling herself before them. Nicole vanished so thoroughly underneath Virginia Woolf's heavy brow and despairing eyes that even she no longer recognized herself. As a grieving mother, she opened wounds that audiences were unaware they carried in Rabbit Hole 2010. I lived that pain long after the cameras were gone. She acknowledged that it earned her another Oscar nomination, but more significantly, it showed how deeply her personal scars bled into her art. From that point on, she stopped chasing safety and balanced torment with grace. In Big Little Lies 2017-2019, Nicole set fire to the flames once more, exposing the hidden horrors of domestic violence and leaving sets silent after every scene. She won an Emmy and a Golden Globe, but more importantly, she provided a lifeline to women who whispered, "That is my story too." Then came Being the Ricardos 2021, in which she disappeared into Lucille Ball with such eerie genius that it earned her a fifth Oscar nomination. In Expats 2024, she was not only the embodiment of grief and resiliency, but also the creator of the series, influencing as both an actress and a producer. Despite everything, one truth remains. Behind the dresses and applause, there were silent nights, broken marriages, children slipping from her arms, and a heart that bled more often than it healed. Every role was not an escape, but a confession. Every performance was not craft, but a scar. Today, Nicole Kidman is not just a woman playing roles, but a survivor who has etched her suffering into the film industry. Before Nicole Kidman ever entered his life, before Grammys glittered on his shelf or stadiums thundered his name, Keith Urban had already entrusted his future, his heart, and his hope to another woman, Laura Sigler, and watched it all fall apart under the same demons that almost destroyed him. She's the story written in blood, silence, and fire. For nearly 10 years, she carried his brokenness as if it were her own, holding together a love that started with tender dreams and laughter, but ended in a silence so crushing it could break the strongest bones. She was his anchor, his compass, and the fiancé who believed in him when he could hardly believe in himself. They met in the late 1980s when Keith was just a boy in his early 20s playing to half-empty pubs in Queensland, guitar strings ringing through. Half-empty pubs in Queensland, guitar strings ringing through smoke and beer-soaked air. What should have been vows spoken beneath flowers turned into a requiem whispered in the dark, and they were forever drowned under the weight of Keith's most vicious enemy, addiction. Laura saw what others missed, a young man who was burning from the inside out, as if every note was a desperate prayer for survival, rather than just a musician vying for attention. Together, they created a flimsy haven, a small apartment that smelled of candle wax and cheap pasta, laughter that poured into the night, whispered promises about children, and a small house away from the chaos. And when Keith gave up all security in 1992 to risk everything on Nashville, Laura carried him across oceans in spirit, bound by conviction that their love was strong enough to endure rejection, starvation, and nights when the phone didn't ring until dawn. By the mid-1990s, she wore his ring as a covenant rather than an ornament. She would persevere despite failure, slammed doors, and the abyss of uncertainty, or so they believed. However, dreams are heavy, and demons are even heavier. Nashville was more brutal than they had anticipated, and doors did not simply close. Instead, they slammed one after another until the silence roared louder than any applause. Laura waited, her patience turning to sadness, as Keith looked for escape in that void, with alcohol and cocaine providing corroded solace. She served cold dinners, penned letters pleading with him to return home clean, and sat by the phone while it remained silent for countless evenings. He left out the fact that everything first met Laura, who once confided to a friend that loving Keith was like loving two men, the haunted soul who disappeared into a bottle and the tender dreamer who held me close. Years later, Keith acknowledged, "I was lost and I almost lost everything." Their laughter turned to silence, the kind that screams heavier than slammed doors, louder than arguments. The man she was supposed to marry was leaving her for a darkness she could never pull him back from, not for another woman. The end did not explode, instead, it unraveled. Laura found him slumped in shadow one night, his guitar left in the corner, his eyes hollow. No shouting, no doors slamming, just the hollow echo of forever breaking. The engagement ring on her finger caught a faint flicker of light, trembling as her hand moved. Tears were forming lines down her cheeks as she slipped it off, placed it gently on the table, and whispered a word she had fought for years not to say, "I can't do this anymore." She loved me when I didn't even love myself, but love can't save you if you don't want to be saved. Laura, with equal sorrow, once confessed, "I didn't stop loving him." For Keith, it was just another fire devouring his life, but this time there was nothing left to save. Years later, his voice cracked with quiet ache. She spent almost 10 years of her youth waiting for a wedding that never materialized, for a man who was not yet able to choose life over destruction. Walking away did not erase her love. Rather, it left scars that would never go away. "I stopped believing I could save him." Those words remain the epitaph of their love, not betrayal but tragedy, because sometimes love does not fail for lack of strength, but rather because no devotion, no matter how fierce, can fight a war one soul must choose to fight alone. Keith was left in her absence with a silence so brutal that it forced him to face his demons and start the long, unsteady climb toward redemption. While Keith Urban was losing the woman who had carried his brokenness for almost 10 years, Nicole Kidman was stepping into what she thought would be her forever. In the silence Laura left behind, destiny was already preparing the way for the woman who would one day stand with him in the fire, not to leave him there, but to walk with him through it. Nicole Kidman, adored, celebrated, admired, had walked through fire and no one saw her burn, met Tom Cruise on the set of Days of Thunder 1990 at the age of 23. But when the lights went down and the curtains came down, what was left was not Hollywood's glowing darling, but a young woman barefoot in the ruins of a love she believed would last forever. She dubbed him her lightning strike love, the man she thought she would spend her old age with, and together they became Hollywood's golden illusion. To her, it was lightning sudden, searing, and unquestionable. He wasn't simply a co-star, he was the center of her universe. Even the most brilliant fairy tales conceal their darkest moments from the public eye. Behind those glittering flashbulbs, moments from the public eye. Behind those glittering flashbulbs, Nicole suffered heartbreaks so intimate that no one ever saw her break. Hands intertwined on red carpets, smiles shining like porcelain masks, royalty in a country of cameras, she felt hollowed out by miscarriages, staring into an empty crib and whispering prayers to a God who would not listen. She turned to motherhood for solace from her grief, adopting Isabella in 1992 and Connor in 1995 with Tom, children who became her lifeline. She spoon-fed them between takes on film sets and read bedtime stories in trailers with the quiet devotion of a mother trying to keep a family together with whispered promises. The lady who could command a set found herself shrinking in her own house, and years later she revealed the unspoken truth: "I could give up everything as long as my children are happy." However, in doing so, she was gradually giving up herself, and her decision ceased to be her own. In 2001, Nicole came home to discover her life had been wiped out with a single act. Tom had filed for divorce. There had been no warning, no last plea, just absence. "I felt as though I no longer existed in that relationship. I loved him, but I had forgotten who I was." The end did not come with thunder, but with a whisper that was sharp enough to cut. The tabloids referred to it as a celebrity split, but for Nicole, it was apocalypse. "I knew things weren't the same," she recalled later, her voice shaking, "but I never thought he would be the one to walk away." Overnight, her marriage, her family, her future, everything she had built, vanished like vapor. Then came the most devastating wound, not losing Tom, but losing the children she had fought so hard to keep. Isabella and Connor, the very heartbeats that had carried her through miscarriages and despair, chose to stay with their father and followed a path she could not share. No slammed doors, no final argument, just silence. She asked unanswerable argument, just silence. She asked unanswerable questions in the echo of her home. Was I not enough? Did he ever love me? What did I do wrong? She once softly remarked. They decided to live with their father. Calls became few, visits diminished. They made that choice. I appreciate that, but beneath that poise was a storm that no picture could capture, the agony of a mother whose love had run its course. But Nicole remained strong even in the face of ashes. She poured her pain into her craft and persevered with the kind of elegance that comes only from destruction. In the early hours of 2002, a year after her divorce, she disappeared into Virginia Woolf so thoroughly that she later muttered, "I didn't see Nicole anymore. I witnessed a woman coming apart." Her Oscar win was more than just acknowledgement, it was a sign of her recovery, evidence that she could remain radiant, defiant, and alive even after being deprived of marriage, motherhood, and identity. Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise's marriage is remembered as tragedy rather than scandal, a seemingly unending love story that ended in silence. A mother's embrace broken by distance. In her own home, a woman was erased and clawed her way back into herself, but in that silence, she discovered a fire that no one could put out. Perhaps the most fundamental truth about love is that it can either crown or erase you, leaving you hollow and scorched. But it is up to you to decide whether those ashes will bury you or ignite you. Nicole Kidman decided to ignite. Nicole Kidman was stepping into what she believed would be her forever, while Keith Urban was losing the woman who had carried his brokenness for almost 10 years. In doing so, she changed from Hollywood's darling into something much more. She was a survivor who turned every scar into light and every silence into a story that will never fade. A marriage so brilliant that it made her blind to the darkness underlying it, two souls traveling in opposing directions, one clinging to a fairy tale while the other unraveled in quiet, both unaware that fate was already preparing to entwine their scars, both having experienced their private ruins by 2005. Nicole, hollowed out by divorce and separation from the children she had once poured her soul into, concealed her grief behind the gleam of red carpets. Neither was whole, neither was prepared. But when they met that January at a Hollywood gala, something unsaid passed between them. Keith, scarred by addiction and loneliness, stood on stages roaring with thousands, but felt completely unseen. Nicole did not fall for the music or the fame, and Keith would later admit that it took him 4 months to call her because he was so overcome by awe and self-doubt. However, once he did, their bond deepened in silence and depth, far from the spotlight. A year later, on June 25, 2006, they stood in a candlelit church in Sydney. To the outside world, it was a fairy tale, but to Keith, it was salvation. He would later say, "I truly began living when I married her." She saw the wounded man still trying to heal, and Keith, for the first time, let himself be seen. But almost immediately after their wedding, Keith relapsed, descending into the very darkness he had vowed to leave behind. Nicole could have walked the walk, but instead she organized an intervention, bringing together doctors, friends, and her own unwavering courage. She looked at him with love that refused to leave him, not condemnation. And for Keith, that night became the difference between ruin and salvation. He went to rehab for the woman who had decided to fight alongside him rather than against him, and recovery brought clarity, him rather than against him, and recovery brought clarity, which in turn brought new life. Nicole gave birth to their first daughter, Sunday Rose, in 2008. Holding her newborn was a miracle for a woman who had suffered through miscarriages and the pain of empty cribs, but even miracles come with fear. Nicole cried in the middle of the night when her body was unable to produce milk, fearing that she was already failing her child, but Keith was there, whispering that it was love, not perfection, that made her a mother. Nicole, who had experienced the pain of infertility, stated words that became her silent gospel: "Whether they are born to you, adopted, or carried by someone else, they are your children. You love them with all your heart." Faith Margaret, her miracle from another woman, arrived in 2010 through surrogacy. Keith wrote songs in the kitchen while Nicole read scripts by the fire, and they walked hand in hand through their Nashville home, choosing simplicity over spectacle. For almost 20 years, they built a life together, brick by brick, balancing blazing careers with delicate domestic rhythms. In that truth, their home filled with laughter that once seemed impossible. They grieved together when her father died in 2014 and again in 2023 when her mother followed, leaving her with an emptiness no award could ever fill. Nicole cried when wildfires swept across Australia in 2020, reaching the edge of their property, not only out of fear of losing a house but also out of terror that even rebuilt happiness could vanish overnight. Keith held her hand during this time. Nicole, who had previously been erased inside a marriage, now understood what it meant to be fully seen, and Keith, who had once been lost in arenas full of strangers, had found his purpose in being her anchor. Their love was not perfect, it had to be fought for. Keith frequently claimed that long walks in the country or making pancakes for his girls were more important than the Grammys and chart toppers. "I married the man I believed in, not the one everyone else saw," Nicole once admitted. They overcame bereavement, relapse, and unrelenting public scrutiny together, but despite everything, they consistently picked one another. They appeared to be unbreakable for 19 years. Nevertheless, even the strongest ties can weaken. In 2024, what started out as whispers quickly grew into an echo that the entire globe could not ignore. Keith Urban had softly left the house they had once built in Nashville, which was filled with lullabies and laughing. There was an agonizing silence in the house where children's feet used to patter on hardwood floors, where piano keys used to stutter under small fingers, and where Sunday mornings were once scented with pancakes. Lights that used to glow past midnight were extinguished before nightfall, according to neighbors. Friends murmured about Nicole showing up for premieres by herself, her eyes ringed with something unsaid, yet her smile was polished. Others saw Keith walking the streets of Nashville with his shoulders bent, as though he was bearing a burden that no one else could see. Keith and Nicole's 19-year marriage, which the world had assumed was unbreakable, abruptly shook like glass in a storm. No betrayal, no scandal, no tabloid outburst. Simply the gradual suffocation of two individuals who had given their all to one another, only to wake up one morning and realize that even love may run out of steam. The news was hardly entertainment for the fans, it was sorrow. Keith and Nicole had demonstrated that fairy tales might emerge from the ashes for over 20 years, that a wounded lady and a shattered man could mend themselves into a family, music, and film miracle. The couple who previously gave millions of people hope for second chances were now split. Social media erupted in flames. It wasn't just a marriage failing, strangers remarked. What hope is there for the rest of us? If Keith and Nicole couldn't make it, it was the breakdown of a narrative that the world had relied on for support. A tale with a heart full of hope that is now leaking out in quiet. After that, in 2025, rumors became reality. Citing irreconcilable differences, Nicole Kidman discreetly filed for divorce in Tennessee on September 30, 2025. The antiseptic language of custody agreements and asset distribution replaced the candlelit vows that had started the process. Ordinary in ink, extraordinary in significance. The legal records indicated that Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret, their girls, would live mainly with Nicole, and Keith would be allowed visitation days included in a schedule that no melody could ease. Unverified but persistent, that no melody could ease. Unverified but persistent rumors circulated about estates valued at more than $250 million. Nashville mansions, Sydney retreats, and New York penthouses will now be valued on the market rather than in recollections. Analysts whispered about custody agreements and prenuptial provisions. However, a cost that no ledger could contain was hidden behind the financials. Since presence, not stuff, was hidden behind the financials. Since presence, not stuff, were the real loss. Imagine Keith looking at a family photo while sitting alone himself in a furnished apartment. With their girl's girl in the summer sun, Nicole put her arm around him, realizing that the one stage that meant most, his own home, could not be saved by a Grammy, an arena, or a thunderous round of applause. Imagine Nicole sitting in the silent corridor while her teenage girls shut the doors to their bedrooms, smelling steadily and wishing them a good night while concealing the tempest within. She shattered when the house eventually became quiet, not because she didn't love them enough, but rather because she realized she couldn't provide them with the intact home she had promised. These were not love betrayals. They were betrayals of vulnerability, of situation, of scars that devotion alone could not heal. They have stood by one another through every storm for 19 years. Nicole's belief gave Keith, the youngster who had once drowned in addiction, new life. Keith gave Nicole, the woman who had been erased in a previous marriage, a space to fully exist. Together, they transformed stillness into song, sadness into laughter, and survival into love. Time, however, proved to be cruel. Her sorrow over buried parents and estranged children, the relentless burden of lives lived under a glare no family could endure forever, ghosts reappearing, and his demons lurking in the shadows. No amount of love, no matter how intense, could stop the echoes. Thus, their tale intense, could stop the echoes. Thus, their tale finishes in silence rather than outrage, a quiet that is both painful enough to shatter bones and gentle enough to serve as a reminder that love can temporarily preserve us even when it cannot stay forever. This stillness now haunts the hearts of millions who once believed in them, as well as the corridors of their now empty house. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman is not that they lived to the end, but rather that they turned brokenness into a family, agony into poetry, and fire into song over the course of 19 years, luminous, imperfect, and unforgettable. They are no longer married. However, what persists is the love they created, the storms they weathered, the kids they reared, and lives they impacted. Perhaps their silent details that were not caught on camera are more eerie than their red carpet smiles. On a kitchen table is a wedding ring, a portrait of a family with the face down. Dust is collecting on a piano in the corner, evidence that even the most romantic tales can end, but also evidence that they shone brightly enough to illuminate the globe for 19 years. Ultimately, what's left? The globe for 19 years. Ultimately, what's left is a reckoning rather than a decision, a contract, or even the glistening remnants of red carpets. Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman were more than just married for 19 years. They used survival, love, and tenacity to build an empire. Now, that empire has fallen apart. The question is not who owns what, but rather what endures when even the most fervent devotion is exhausted. Their combined wealth was as remarkable as their notoriety. Long regarded as one of the most powerful figures in film, Nicole has an estimated net worth of over $250 million, which she amassed through decades of Academy Award-winning performances, production projects under Blossom Films, and luxury brand endorsements. Keith, the youngster who once played in smoky bars to make ends meet, amassed a wealth of around $75 million thanks to his hit albums, international tours that sold out in a matter of minutes, and a repertoire of songs that continue to fill stadiums. Their combined fortune surpassed $325 million, creating an empire of memories as well as cash. Their story was as expansive as their real estate holdings. Keith penned songs early dawn, while Nicole made breakfast for their daughters in a farmhouse in Nashville. They once had a dream that their kids would grow up by the water in a penthouse by the harbor in Sydney. A Manhattan condominium overlooking Central Park in New York serves as their haven from the cacophony of Hollywood. They sought privacy away from cameras on the 111-acre estate in Boonah Hill, Australia, which is worth millions of dollars. It was reported that the total value of their holdings exceeded $50 million. Every property exceeded $50 million. Every property represents a phase of their shared existence. The magnitude of what they had in common becomes clear when you consider the garages filled with Bentleys, Range Rovers, and the garages filled with Bentleys, Range Rovers, and expensive cars, as well as Keith's invaluable collection of old guitars. One fact, however, is still brutally obvious when the dust of courtrooms and contracts settles. The broken hearts left behind cannot be repaired by wealth, a mansion, a car, or an award. Neither Nicole's nor Keith's, nor even the daughters who never requested any of this, the pain of a family transformed by silence cannot be eased by the empire they created, which is measured in millions and milestones. Even though the house is worth millions of dollars, a piano inside is collecting dust. As if even the walls can't bear to recall, a family portrait falls face down, and a wedding band lies neglected on a kitchen table. Maybe the only thing we can hope for them right now is kindness. That people can find serenity together or apart, that the scars of today might eventually fade into the past, and they are still led ahead by that love, in whatever shape it endures. The world will always hope that they carry joy in their hearts, and that their girls grow up knowing that they were fiercely loved in every word uttered, every sacrifice made, and every secret prayer whispered during those 19 years. Even if they never walk the same route again, their tale now lies with us rather than in the press. The audience who previously had faith in them, who took courage from their ability to turn fire into family, and who found strength in their survival. Perhaps this conclusion serves as a reminder that love, despite its transformations, continues to bring light ahead rather than as a sign of hopelessness. Whether their paths continue to diverge or eventually reunite, may we make room for them with empathy, express our thoughts with kindness, and offer silent prayers that Keith and Nicole will always find solace, happiness, and healing. They reverberate because 19 years of love do not fade. They persevere. They serve as a reminder that love can illuminate the world even when it breaks.